Hello, and welcome to Perspectives. My name is Jocelyn Faintek. I am a millennial in this millennial boomer discussion on various human resources issues that are pressing in the workplace today.
Hello, I am John Platts, and I'm a former vice president of human resources with a number of Canadian companies. I formed our consulting firm several years ago now, largely because of many of the client issues related to the minefields associated with human resource industrial relations. And we thought it would be appropriate to showcase a few issues here around employer relations. I'm sometimes reluctant to talk about human resources, but employer relations issues. And frankly, is there a difference between what a millennial and a boomer would be thinking about the same subjects?
We are going to be talking about absenteeism in the workplace, what culpable and non-culpable absenteeism is, and what to look for and measures you can take to reduce an absenteeism problem with your staff.
In fact, the whole issue around absenteeism, I think we spend an enormous amount of time actually talking with clients about this issue of absenteeism, only because there are so many ways to have protected leaves anymore. And we have certainly seen that in Ontario, and frankly, I think most provinces have followed suit to a large extent. But the issue of absenteeism is really touching on this matter of, well, how do we deal with it? And if you've got a protected leave, how do you stop somebody from being away? Because what's it doing? It's making other people having to pick up the slack when a person doesn't report to work or it doesn't get done at all. And that is becomes the major problem for any employer, anyone who's scheduling employees. But it does touch on, I guess, a couple of things that are important, and Jocelyn has indicated one of them. That's also understanding the difference between culpable and non-culpable, and we'll get there in a moment. But I've got a question for Jocelyn, and that is, if you have a business that operates 24/7, and there's a Friday night shift, do you want to work it?
No.
I don't either. So there's quite an age difference between us, but neither one of us wants to work that. So it has nothing to do, frankly, with our ages whatsoever. It has everything to do with none of us want to have work that we choose not to do. And that can be manifested in so many different ways. So a lot of people think, well, we have to coddle the millennials and give them the Friday night off because they don't want to work it and they have to be coddled. And the old folk should have to work it. Well, I don't want to work it either. In fact, I'm going to invoke my seniority. So she will have to work it. But then she's going to quit.
Wow.
So what do you think? How do we deal with something like that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think John touched on a really good point, which quite frankly is the purpose of giving you our perspectives, because the workforce is changing, but some things remain constant in that nobody wants to work a bad shift. Nobody wants to work on a Friday night, regardless of how old you are, what your background is, what your demographic is. You know, people want to have a work-life balance regardless of what your background is. So I think that in to answer your question about what would you do in that situation, you know, that's part of the job. And if you find somebody, regardless of what their background is or who they are, if they're a millennial or not, that's part of what's expected. And if they don't do what's expected, you treat them like every other employee. You discipline them.
And I guess that's really the key to the whole thing, is that there should be no distinction made. And so this notion that somehow the millennials are going to have to be looked at in a much more favorable light, we're suggesting that that doesn't have to be the case at all. In fact, the whole foundation of fairness is that you do not discriminate based on age. In fact, age, which we start talking about when we talk about the generational differences, actually becomes discriminatory, even having the conversation. So that absenteeism conversation about demographics is probably never a good conversation to have. So let's go shifting back into the absenteeism itself as the culpable and non-culpable. It's really important not to put them together, bundle them together, because your process to deal with them is very fundamentally different. When it comes to the issue around culpable behavior, i.e. blameworthy, they've done something wrong, then such as absent without leave. then you're talking about discipline. When you're talking about non-blameworthy, and that is somebody who declares they're sick. Now, we don't always believe when a person says they're sick, they really are sick. But that's gone on for decades. That hasn't changed. And so many people will say, well, I'm going to ask them for a doctor's letter in the future. Now, that doctor's letter, everybody demands it, nobody believes it. So why do we even do it? Why do we spend the time? Well, then we say, well, there's a deterrent effect. Well, that may or may not be true. But the fact of the matter is, in dealing with that employee who declares they're sick with or without a doctor's note, you actually have to assume that they are sick. And when they're sick, you are going to have to ultimately look at all your obligations as it relates to any human rights legislation, because now we're talking about a disabled person, whether we believe it or not. Remember, they said they're sick. And we are going to have to deal with everything from a duty to accommodate conversation, to asking them to do what they need to do with their physician, to have them report regularly on a Friday, which they seem to be missing all the time. And ultimately, it will result in a non-blameworthy termination, where you've informed them that their unreliability is now becoming suspect and a concern, and we can't afford that unreliability any longer. And they'll be terminated without cause. But it's so important to understand the differences between culpable and non-culpable behavior. And most people use the shield of sickness, and it really does require a lot more energy in order to ultimately deal with that particular employee issue.
Well said. Don't fire somebody for being sick.